Say to my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the Speed Meter Steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Now, over the last few centuries, many inventions were developed that over time radically changed the modern world. Yet, in most cases, these inventions were not necessarily immediately embraced by humanity, but rather took decades to become ingrained into the culture. Electronic computers are one example. Invented in the early 1940s, it took over 40 years of both technological development and integration into businesses and homes before they were both accepted and trusted. And cars took about as long as computers to grow in technology and general acceptance to the public. So let's take a look at how humanity created modern car culture. Cars, that is, personal road vehicles offered for general sale, came about in the 1880s. Prior to that, if you wanted such a device, you'd have to design and build it yourself, which some folks did actually do, but for the most part, those early vehicles were for commercial use. And so when Carl Benz placed an advertisement in the local paper offering his patent motorwagen, early 1888, it was the first time anywhere in the world that the public was offered a car for sale, and no one bought one. Cars were so new that most people didn't know exactly what to make of them. Some folks were fascinated by the new invention and wanted to learn more about them. Others just shrugged off their curiosity and considered cars to be a passing fad. And then there were the naysayers, which at that time in history were in the majority. They pointed out, and admittedly they were pretty much correct, that cars were unreliable, difficult to operate, and a danger to people, horses, and anything else on or near the road. Then, Bertha Benz went on her famous road trip. All along the route, crowds gathered to see this automobile in action. By the time she reached Grandma's house, reporters had gathered, and the news of her amazing journey spread across the telegraphs and onto the headlines of papers across Europe. And as a result of this, Benz cars began to sell. And not just his cars. Gottlieb Daimler also benefited from this recognition, as well as Dion, who were at this point making steam cars. The news of Bertha's journey was particularly embraced in France, and it is reasonable to say that modern car culture as we know it was indeed born there. The importance of the 1889 Paris World's Fair upon the world of cars cannot be understated. In the Great Hall of Machines, which, by the way, actually cost some 7 times more to build than the Eiffel Tower, Daimler, Benz, Dion, and a newcomer, Peugeot, along with his engineer Leon Serpollet, displayed cars to the world. Over 30 million people attended this exhibition, and it was here that the car bug bit the planet. The newspapers and magazines were filled with the new inventions presented at this fair, cars being rather prominent in such articles. As a result, France exploded with new car manufacturers, and within 4 years, France would build more cars than any other nation. Each of these French companies wanted to build and sell cars that outdid the rest. But how do you prove that your car is the best? Racing seemed the answer. In the last decade of the 19th century, car races sprang up all over Europe, especially in France. Now, the first races weren't races as we know them today. They were trials and rallies. Organized by various newspapers, these first automotive events were designed to sell newspapers, and sell they did. Yet the newspapers also decided who won the race by their own standards, which did not always align with the standards of the drivers and manufacturers. One of these was, of course, Count Albert de Dion. The good Count understood the power of the press, yet wanted to establish unified rules for auto racing that the newspapers would stand behind. Thus, he created the first governing agency for auto racing, the Automobile Club of France, established in 1895. Through this club, rules for racing cars would be established and enforced at sanctioned races. Other enthusiasts in various nations did likewise and created their clubs. For example, the American Automobile Association, also known as AAA, and of course ADAC, Allemagne Deutscher Automobilclub. Though cooperation between these and other clubs, racing was promoted via the publications of the time. But races were sporting events, not part of daily life. In late Victorian Europe, the idea of owning a car was just not reasonable for most folks. I mean, why would you? For local travel, there was ample public transportation, and of course, you could get a bicycle. For long distance, trains and ferries were abundant. Even horses were not used for private transportation very much. Go take a look at some photos from late 19th century European cities, and you won't find many people riding them. Rather, horses were used for commercially pulling wagons or for carriages of the wealthy. So if cars were ever to become commonplace, a reason to own one would have to be invented. André Michelin provided a reason: touring. The idea was simple. There were locations that could be reached through public transportation, but by a rather circuitous route. It would be too much of a bother to just spuriously go to such places unless you had a bike or a car. Michelin made pneumatic tires, and both bicycles and cars needed them. So, if you had a car, you would need maps to figure out your route. You would need to know where the tire shops were, where you could get fuel, and of course, a good place to go. He sent out his minions to research good places to visit, tourist attractions. These would be parks, monuments, archaeological sites of interest, and of course, and most famously, a good place to eat. Compiling and publishing his first edition in 1900, the Michelin Guide is still, to this day, the gold standard of automotive touring. And for a restaurant to earn 1, 2, or 3 stars from Michelin is considered one of the greatest honors in the world of chefs. In late 19th century, public media outlets were rather limited. Newspapers, magazines, and books were the primary ways to learn about new inventions, though theater acts, vaudeville, were also popular at the time. Once the 20th century began, more methods to get the word out about cars became available, in particular the movie camera and the phonograph. When it comes to cars, movie cameras were used to film races at first. The first race to be so filmed was the 1902 Paris to Vienna, and the footage was shown across the world in vaudeville theaters. The exciting action was riveting for folks seeking entertainment, and filming car races has been pretty much standard practice ever since. People young and old watched these early intrepid race car drivers vie for the win, and many of these drivers would gain international fame through their motoring exploits being shown on the silver screen. Yet cars were still not a common thing at the turn of the century. Yes, it's exciting to watch a race, but in daily life, cars were still not seen much on the streets of the world. And when one did show up, crowds would come to either marvel at it or treat it with disdain. Cars were not trusted at first by the general public, and much work would have to be done, both in technological advancements and promotion, to make newfangled automobiles really stick. It was not until well after World War I that cars began to supplant horse-drawn vehicles, bicycles, and of course the Mark I human foot in the city streets. And it was in the late 1920s that the movie camera began to show an audience car culture. The first feature film that focused on cars was the movie The First Auto, which starred Barney Oldfield and was released in 1927. The movie is a period film, the story taking place around 1900, give and take 5 years or so. But it does fairly accurately depict the attitude of many people about the invention of the car. It is a silent film of some 75 minutes, but it's worth a watch if you can find it. And of course, there's Laurel and Hardy. These two comedians used cars, specifically Ford Model Ts, for the most destructive of slapstick purposes. Keep in mind that in the late 1920s, you could purchase a used running Tin Lizzie for as little as $5. And this classic comedy duo came up with some incredible ways to destroy them. For example, they squished them between streetcars like an accordion, ran them over with trains, and even put one through a sawmill and neatly cut it in two. Being able to laugh at cars was very impactful in establishing their acceptance by the general public. Which brings up the phonograph. Prior to World War I, movie cameras were expensive, and so if you wanted to see a movie, you had to go to a theater. Not so with record players. They could be purchased by anyone of modest means, were easy to use, and could perform just about anywhere. Phonographs could be found in homes across the industrialized world, and the making and selling of records became a big industry. And when it comes to using the record player to promote car culture in those early years of the 20th century, one name stands out: Billy Murray. Murray was one of the most famous singers of the first quarter of the 20th century. He recorded over 100 songs for many different labels: Edison, RCA, OK, and others. Many of his songs were about cars and from a few different angles. Songs about specific brands like Oldsmobile and Ford, as well as songs about just what it's like to have a car, be it for good or ill. Some of his most famous car songs are My Merry Oldsmobile, The Little Ford Rambled Along, Gasoline Gus, and Get Out and Get Under. These are all searchable on YouTube, so if you'd like to hear the singer that inspired the intro to this channel, it's a good 20-minute time kill. And in his songs, you will hear the genesis of modern car culture. And let's not forget children. During the first quarter of the 20th century, toy manufacturers began to make miniature cars for children to play with. It's actually a smart thing to do. Kids will one day be potential customers, and getting children acclimated to cars ensured that they would want to own a real one when they grow up. Children's books began to feature cars, most famously at the time Kenneth Grahame's The Wind in the Willows. Now, Grahame never tells us what make of car was driven by Mr. Toad, but since it was written in England in 1908, was red, and had a brass radiator, my vote is that it was a Humber. By the 1930s, cars were here to stay. Children grew up playing with them. Songs and movies about them were ubiquitous, and the infrastructures needed to support them. Roads, gas stations, repair garages, and the like were springing up across the globe. Today, it's hard to imagine a world without them. Yet, in my own lifetime, I saw the same sort of cultural integration happen with the computer. I was 14 years old when I saw a computer for the first time, and I marveled at it, though many people I knew scoffed, saying it was just an unreliable and expensive toy. Oh, has the culture changed. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.